Good evening. Today's lesson is over one-step equations with fractions and decimals. And my learning target is I can solve one-step equations that have fractions and decimals for a variable. So recall from last week when we talked about solving one-step equations using addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Well, this is the same concept, only using a little bit more complicated problems that involve fractions and decimals. Now remember, our goal for solving is to get a value for a variable. Okay, so we're trying to take a variable and give it some value. We don't want it to be unknown anymore. We want it to have a intrinsic value. We want it to be assumed something. All right. So in my first problem here, I've got 1/4 is equal to x plus 5/9. Now, true to solving, I want to get the x by itself on one side, and I'm adding 5/9 to it, which means that I have to do the opposite, right? So if I want to do the opposite of addition, then I have to subtract. So I'm going to subtract 5/9 from both sides. And keep in mind, for future reference, always keep like terms above each other so that it's easy enough to keep track of what you're subtracting from what. Now over here, I'm kind of actually do the subtraction, because remember, subtraction of fractions is a little bit more in depth than subtraction of just regular numbers. So I'm going to take 1/4 and subtract 5/9. Okay. Now, to subtract these two things, I have to get a common denominator. Right now, they're not subtractable because I have a 4 over here and a 9 over here. Now, unfortunately, my least common denominator is going to be 36. Okay? And that's because that's the number that both is the lowest number that's divisible by both 4 and 9 at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to try to make both bottom sides 36, which means I'm going to multiply both the top and the bottom of this fraction by 9 and get 9 over 36, and I'm going to multiply both the top and bottom of this fraction by 4. Now, do you notice anything special about what happened? Now, when all else fails in terms of common denominators, you can always just multiply the fraction by the number on the denominator of the other fraction. So like, look, I've got a 4 here. I'm going to multiply this fraction top and bottom by 4, and I've got a 9 here, so I'm going to multiply this fraction top and bottom by 9. Okay, so I've got 9 over 36, and I'm subtracting from it 20 over 36. Now keep in mind, when you subtract fractions, the denominator stays the same. So I'm going to keep that 36 and end up with 9 minus 20, which is a negative 11. Okay, you want to reduce if you can, but in this case, none of these two things are not divisible by anything in particular other than themselves. So I cannot reduce this, so I have to leave it as negative 11 over 36. Okay, and so x equals negative 11 over 36. All right. Now, if I wanted to check that, if I plug it back in, I'm going to do my check over here. Okay, I get 1 over 4 is equal to negative 11 over 36 plus, and instead of putting in 9/5, I already know I'm going to need a common denominator, so I've got this 9/5 here that turned into 20/36. So that'll give me a common denominator, so I'm going to make it plus 20 over 36 instead of 5 over 9. Okay, so keep that in mind. I'm replacing 5 over 9 with 20 over 36 to save myself a little bit of work. Okay, so 1/4 is equal to negative 11 plus 20. Now remember, when you're adding fractions together, as long as the denominator is the same, it's going to stay the same regardless. So I've got 9 over 36. If I reduce that, I can divide both the top and the bottom by 9, and so I end up with 1/4 equals 1 over 4, which means that my answer is correct. X is equal to negative 11 over 36. And it's important to check right now when it's simple so that you'll get into the habit later on of checking to make sure your answers are correct when things get a little bit more complicated. Alright, moving on. So in here is just have a problem example with decimals instead of fractions. Okay. Now take a moment and pause the video and see if you can do this one on your own. It's not so different from using whole numbers when you use decimals. Okay, so assuming you tried it on your own, what you should have gotten was that this is x minus 5.8. So in order to get x by itself and give it a value, I have to do the opposite. So I'm going to add 5.8 to both sides. Oops. Okay, and 20 plus 5.8, well, I'm going to add the decimal place. This is technically 28.0. So I get 0 plus 8 is 8. Keep the decimal place, and I get 28 plus 5 is 33. Okay, so we get x equals 33.8. Plug it in for a check. Just replace the x with 33.8. Okay, so 33.8 minus 5.8, you can check that with a calculator if you want, but you're going to get 28 equals 28, which works out. Okay. For my next example, we're going to be dealing with division. So in order to get the x by itself, I'm dividing this x by a fraction, 2/5. Okay, so I have to multiply it by that same fraction, 2/5, in order to get rid of it off the bottom. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2/5, and nice enough, I don't have to get a common denominator for multiplication. So remember, I just have to multiply straight across the top and straight across the bottom. So I'm going to get x is equal to 20 times 2, which is 40, and 1 times 5, which is 5. And nice enough, 40 divided by 5 is 8. So plug that back in for a check. I get 8 over 2/5 equals 20. When I divide a fraction, I flip and multiply. So I'm going to do that over here to check. So I get 8 divided by 2 over 5 is equals 2. So I'm going to flip the fraction, 5 over 2 times 8. And multiply. So 5 times 8 equals 40. Flip it. Divided by 2 is 20. So we get 20 equals 20. So my answer is correct. X equals 8. Alright, and my last example here, I've got problem 3 over 5 times x equals 2 over 15. Now in order to get this x by itself, it's being multiplied. So I've got a couple of options, but since it's technically being multiplied by 3 and divided by 5, I can do the opposite of both in one step. So I'm basically going to take the reciprocal of this fraction and multiply. So I'm going to take that times 5 over 3. That's going to turn this into 1 because this 5 drops out and becomes 1, and this 3 drops out and becomes 1. Okay, so if I do it to one side, I have to do it to the other. I get 5 over 3. So x equals 10 over 45. And we want to simplify that as much as possible, so divide both sides by 5. X equals 2 over 9. Okay, and if I want to check that, I'm going to do that over here. Plug it back in. We get 3 over 5 times 2 over 9 equals 2 over 15. Multiply straight across, we get 6 over 45. So multiply across the top, multiply across the bottom. 2 times 3 is 6, 5 times 9 is 45, and then reduce much as you can, divide by 3. So I get 2 over 15, which is what I wanted. Okay, so my answer, x, is 2 over 9. Alright, so finish the practice at the bottom for tomorrow, and I will see you then. Have a good day.